Rachel Morris put out her cigarette on the sole of her shoe and looked up at the neat white house with blue shutters. A typical American pastor's home in a typical religious town. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. "Detective Morris?" a young officer called out to her, shuffling nervously from foot to foot at the entrance. "Everyone is waiting for you inside." Rachel nodded and adjusted the collar of her leather jacket. After 15 years in Chicago, she still wasn't used to how small towns reacted to a female detective, especially when that woman was open about her orientation, smoked like a steam engine, and preferred whiskey to tea and cookies. "How long ago was the body discovered?" she asked, coming up the porch steps. "About 7 o'clock this morning. Mrs. Brooks had called at 911 when she found her husband in his study. Inside the house, there was organized chaos. Forensics was methodically collecting samples and photographing the crime scene, and in the living room, a middle-aged woman with an unnaturally straight back and a blank stare sat on the couch. An elderly lady sat next to her, offering her a mug of tea, which she stubbornly ignored. "Mrs. Brooks?" Rachel approached the couch. "I'm Detective Rachel Morris. I'm very sorry for your loss." Elizabeth Brooks looked up slowly. Her face, beautiful and well-groomed despite her age, expressed numbness rather than grief. "You are the one," she began, but paused, turning her gaze back to the cup in her hands. "I am," Rachel replied calmly, already used to this reaction. "I'll be investigating your husband's death. If you are able, I need to ask you a few questions." Elizabeth nodded faintly. "Tell me what happened this morning." "I woke up as usual at 6:30. Elizabeth's voice sounded mechanical, as if she were reading from a prepared text. "James wasn't in bed, but that was normal. He often works late and sometimes falls asleep in his office." "Did you go looking for him right away?" "No, I made breakfast, as always. James loved oatmeal with honey and tea." Elizabeth paused. "When he didn't come out to his desk until 7, I got worried and went to his office." Elizabeth fell silent, and 2 tears rolled down her cheeks. Rachel waited patiently. "The door was unlocked. I walked in and saw him. He was lying on the floor. Blood. There was a lot of blood. Did you touch the body or move anything in the room?" "No, I just called 911. I knew he was dead." Rachel nodded and made a note in her notebook. "Did anyone come by last night? Maybe your husband had a meeting or a phone call?" "No," Elizabeth frowned. I don't know exactly. I went to bed early. I had a migraine. James was still working." "What about the previous days? Did you notice anything unusual in your husband's behavior?" Elizabeth hesitated. "No, he was, as usual, preparing for Sunday's sermon, taking care of the congregation." Rachel noticed Elizabeth's fingers gripped the cup tighter at the mention of parishioners, but decided not to press. "Not now." "All right, Mrs. Brooks. I'll come back to you with more questions after I've examined the crime scene. Are you sure you don't want to go to a relative or friend's house?" "No," Elizabeth answered firmly. "My place is here, in the house of God and my husband." Rachel didn't argue and headed toward the pastor's office. She was met at the door by the chief of the local police, Douglas Hammond, a heavy-set man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a wary look. "Morris?" He nodded to her without a smile. "I didn't think they'd send you." "Disappointed, Chief Hammond?" Rachel couldn't contain her sarcasm. "Just surprised. Roswell's a conservative town. The people here are, traditional." "I'm not," Rachel finished for him. "But I'm a good detective, and maybe a fresh set of eyes is exactly what this case needs." Hammond hummed indefinitely and stepped aside to let her into the office. The pastor's body had already been taken away, but the chalk outline on the floor and the dark bloodstains made it clear where it had been found. Rachel walked slowly around the room, scrutinizing every detail. The pastor's office was austere and functional. A massive dark wood desk, a leather chair, cabinets filled with religious literature. On the walls were seminary diplomas and photos of Brooks with parishioners and church officials. "Did you find the murder weapon?" she asked, looking at the blood spatter on the bookshelf. "No," Hammond replied. "Judging from the wounds, it was some kind of heavy blunt object, maybe a poker or something like that." "Is there nothing suitable in the house?" "Not yet." Rachel went over to the pastor's desk. Papers neatly laid out, the Bible open on Proverbs of Solomon. The desk drawers are closed but not locked, In the first are office supplies, in the second are notes for sermons, nothing of note. "Who was the last person to see the pastor alive?" she asked as she continued to look around the table. "As far as we know, his wife, but she says she was already asleep when he was supposedly killed." "And the parishioners? Anyone who might have stopped by late at night?" "Pastor Brooks was—" Hammond hesitated for words. "Very accessible to his parishioners. They could come to him with a problem at any time. So, theoretically, it could have been anyone." Rachel sighed. "What do we know about the pastor himself?" "James Brooks was a pillar of our community," Hammond answered with noticeable pride. "He led the church for 15 years, founded a homeless shelter, a drug program. Everyone respected him." "Everybody has enemies, Chief Hammond. Not Pastor Brooks." Hammond shook his head stubbornly. "That's why we need help from the big city. No one here believes any of the locals could have done this." Rachel looked at him carefully, but remained silent. She knew there were no model citizens without skeletons in their closets, especially those who were so diligent in maintaining an impeccable reputation. Footsteps sounded behind her, and an elegant middle-aged woman with impeccable hair and a pearl necklace entered the office. "Chief Hammond," she nodded, deliberately ignoring Rachel. "May I see Elizabeth?" "Of course, Mrs. Pierce." Hammond straightened up immediately. "She's in the parlor, and this is Detective Morris from Homicide." Only now the woman turned to Rachel, giving her a critical look. "Catherine Pierce," she introduced herself without extending her hand. "I'm an elder of the church and a close friend of Elizabeth's. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Pierce." Rachel smiled, knowing it would only add to her discomfort. "Perhaps you could help us with our investigation." "I will do my best to find whoever committed this horrible crime," Catherine answered dryly. "But right now my place is by Elizabeth's side." "Of course," Rachel nodded. "But I'd like to talk to you later. As a close friend of the family, you might have noticed something important." Catherine nodded reluctantly and left the room. A moment later, a young girl appeared in the doorway, almost a copy of Catherine, but with softer features and sad eyes. "Mama?" she called hesitantly. "She has gone to Mrs. Brooks," Hammond answered. "And you must be Ashley?" The girl nodded, shifting her gaze from the police chief to Rachel. Unlike her mother, there was no judgment in her eyes, but rather fatigue and something else Rachel couldn't quite pinpoint. "Detective Rachel Morris," she introduced herself. "Did you know Pastor Brooks?" "Yes," Ashley answered quietly. He was my mentor. I helped him with Sunday school." Rachel noticed the girl nervously rubbing the sleeve of her sweater. "When was the last time you saw the pastor?" "Yesterday." Ashley lowered her eyes. "At the evening service. We were all, it was business as usual." "Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior?" "No," Ashley answered too quickly. "He was just like he always was." Rachel caught the lie but didn't press the issue. The girl was obviously hiding something, but she'd learned enough for a first conversation. "Thank you, Ashley. If you think of anything else, please contact me." Rachel handed her a business card. Ashley took the card, and after one last glance at the spot where the pastor's body had been found, hurried out of the room. "Strange girl," Hammond remarked, "always so quiet in her mother's shadow." "Sometimes the quiet people notice the most," Rachel replied thoughtfully. The third drawer of the desk was locked. Rachel called the criminalist, who carefully opened it. Inside, the pastor's personal diary, several envelopes with letters, and a small box. In the box, there were cufflinks, a pocket watch, and a photograph. Rachel carefully took it out. The picture was of Ashley Pierce sitting on a park bench, reading a book. The picture had obviously been taken without her knowledge. "Interesting," Rachel mumbled as she put the photo away in the evidence bag. She took a quick look through the diary. Most of the entries dealt with church matters and reflections on scripture, but in the last few pages, the tone changed. The entries became sketchy, contradictory. "Temptation is growing," the pastor wrote. "I should stop, but I can't. She's like a light in the darkness of my hypocrisy." Rachel closed the journal thoughtfully and looked at the pictures on the walls. One of them showed Pastor Brooks standing next to Ashley at some church event. His hand rested on her shoulder, and there was an expression in his eyes that could hardly be called fatherly. "Morris!" Hammond called to her from the doorway. The pathologist says death occurred between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. He'll be more precise after the autopsy. Thank you, Rachel nodded. I'm done here for the day. We'll continue tomorrow. As she left the pastor's house, she took a deep breath of fresh air. The town of Roswell, Massachusetts, with its neat streets and white church overlooking the square, seemed like the epitome of the American dream. But Rachel knew that beneath this idyllic picture often lurked the darkest of secrets. She got into her car and drove to the town's only motel. She was greeted at the front desk by an older woman who smiled welcomingly at first, but immediately became aloof when she heard Rachel's name. Room 16, second floor, at the end of the hall, she said dryly, holding out the key. Rachel only grinned. News travels faster than the wind in small towns, especially news of a lesbian detective from the big city investigating a pastor's murder. Back in the room, the first thing Rachel did was pour herself a whiskey from the flask she always carried with her. Taking a sip, she spread her notes out on the bed and went over them one more time. Something didn't add up in the readings. Elizabeth claimed she didn't know if anyone had been at her husband's house that evening because she'd gone to bed early. But Ashley said she'd seen the pastor at the evening service, which usually didn't end until 9 p.m., so Elizabeth must have known that her husband had come home after the service. Rachel sighed and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She had a long day ahead of her tomorrow. She needed to talk to parishioners, neighbors, question Elizabeth and Ashley again, and of course, dig deeper into Pastor Brooks's impeccable past. With those thoughts, she finished her whiskey, closed her notebook, and went to bed. The image of the pastor and the young girl in the photograph stayed in her mind. Something told her that the relationship between them was far from innocent mentoring, and perhaps that was the clue to the murder. The morning in Roswell greeted Rachel with an unaccustomed silence. In Chicago, even at dawn, the city hummed like a beehive, but here, at 6 in the morning, all that could be heard was birdsong and the distant ringing of bells. Rachel reached for the phone, 3 missed calls from Diane. She smiled quietly and dialed the number. "Good morning, Detective Morris." Diane's voice sounded tired but warm. "How's your pious little town?" "Morning, Professor Klein." Rachel smiled wider. The town was already aware that they'd sent a lesbian detective who drank and smoked. She heard Diana laugh softly. After 7 years together, they had turned this sad pattern into a kind of game. "Let me guess," Diana said. "Did someone accidentally stumble across an article about the famous Rodriguez case?" "Most likely," Rachel sighed. "It was 2 years ago, and the newspapers still can't calm down. Courageous lesbian detective solves Chicago's biggest drug cartel. Don't forget saves a senator's daughter and gets a medal from the mayor. That was your finest hour, sweetheart. And the reason why anyone Googles my name the first time they see me. The Rodriguez case was her professional triumph and personal nightmare. To rescue the senator's kidnapped daughter, she had to spend 3 months undercover in a drug cartel, pretending to be the mistress of one of the leaders. When it was over and 27 people were arrested, journalists dug up her personal life and made a sensation out of it. Lesbian detective seduces drug lord to save girl were the headlines that graced the front pages for weeks. "I miss you," Rachel said quietly. "How's Max?" "Your cat's fine, though he'd obviously rather have you home than me. Yesterday, he defiantly threw your sweater off the chair when I sat in your seat." "Smart boy," Rachel laughed. "I'll try to get back as soon as possible." "Be careful, okay?" Diana's voice became serious. "These small towns can be more dangerous than any metropolis. Don't worry, Professor. I'm just looking for the murderer of a righteous pastor. What could possibly go wrong?" Having finished talking, Rachel packed up and left the motel. Chief Hammond's squad car was already waiting for her with a driver, a young officer named Parker, the same one who had met her at the parsonage. "Good morning, Detective," he said, looking carefully past her. "The chief asked me to take you to the station, then the morgue, and then wherever you want to go." "Thank you, Officer Parker," Rachel replied, getting into the back seat. "How long have you been with the Roswell Police Department?" 3 years, ma'am." He was still avoiding her gaze. "Before that, I was in the Army. What was that like, guarding a town where nothing ever happens?" Parker met her eyes in the rearview mirror for a moment and then looked away. "Everyone here knows each other. We look out for each other. Did anyone look out for Pastor Brooks?" Rachel asked, watching the officer's reaction carefully. Parker's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. Pastor Brooks didn't need supervision. He was a good man. That's what they all say, but good men are rarely the victims of such crimes. Not in our town, Parker replied stubbornly. Chief Hammond was waiting for them at the station. To Rachel's surprise, he looked more friendly than yesterday. Detective Morris, he nodded at her. I got a call from your superiors in Chicago. They speak very highly of you. Glad to hear it, Rachel replied dryly. What's the latest? Pathologist's preliminary report. Death occurred between 12 and 2 in the morning, caused by blunt force trauma to the head. The blow was from behind, which would indicate that the victim knew his killer and wasn't expecting an attack. Or the killer took him by surprise, Rachel noted. Anything under the fingernails? Signs of a struggle? Nothing. He didn't even seem to realize what had happened. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. I want to talk to the church staff and parishioners. Make a list of anyone who might have seen Pastor Brooks that night. And I need to talk to his wife and Ashley Pierce again. Mrs. Brooks is at the church right now accepting condolences, Hammond said. She asked not to be disturbed until after dinner. And Ashley? Probably in college. She's at Roswell Community College, in the English Literature department. Rachel nodded and headed for the exit. Parker will take you, Hammond said. And, Detective, please be discreet. People here are very upset. I'm always discreet, Chief Hammond. Rachel smiled with one lip. Especially when I'm looking for a killer. Roswell College was a complex of 3 brick buildings with a small park between them. Ashley wasn't hard to find. She was sitting on a bench under an oak tree, staring at a book, just like the picture from the pastor's office. Ashley? Rachel approached her. Could I talk to you for a minute? The girl flinched and looked up. She looked even more exhausted than she had yesterday. Detective Morris. Ashley closed her book. I was expecting you to come. I need to ask you some questions about Pastor Brooks. Rachel sat down next to her. You said he was your mentor. Tell me more about it. Ashley nervously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. It started about a year ago. I was helping with Sunday school, and the pastor noticed that I was good at explaining the Bible to kids. He offered me extra classes in theology, said I had a talent for understanding scripture. And how did these classes work? Usually in his office after the service or in the afternoon when the church was empty. Ashley lowered her eyes. We'd read the Bible, discussing difficult points. Sometimes other books, philosophy, history of religion. Just the 2 of you? Ashley nodded without looking up. Did your mother know about these studies? Yes, she was proud, said it was an honor to receive private lessons from Pastor Brooks. And Mrs. Brooks? Ashley's hands balled into fists, knuckles white. I don't know. We haven't discussed it. Ashley, Rachel said softly. I saw the picture in the pastor's office. The one of you reading in the park. Did you know he took that picture? The girl's face turned even paler. No, he took a picture of me? Why? Her reaction seemed genuine, and Rachel noted it in her mind. You said you saw the pastor at the Vespers service the day he died. Did you notice anything unusual? Maybe he was arguing with someone or nervous? Ashley thought about it. No, it was business as usual. Although, she hesitated. After the service, Mrs. Brooks came up to him. They were talking off to the side, and she looked upset. But I didn't hear what they were saying. Thank you, Ashley. You've been very helpful. Rachel stood up. If you think of anything else, give me a call. Detective? Ashley suddenly grabbed her arm. You're going to find whoever did this, aren't you? Rachel saw fear in the girl's eyes, but also something akin to hope. I'll do my best, she answered. The truth has a way of coming to the surface, even when they try to drown it. The next item on Rachel's list was church. Roswell's First United Church stood in the center of town, a white building with a tall steeple and stained glass windows. It was quiet and cool inside. A few people sat in the pews, immersed in prayer. In the far corner, Rachel spotted Elizabeth Brooks, with Catherine Pierce standing beside her like a faithful shadow. Detective, Catherine hissed, noticing Rachel. This isn't a good time. Elizabeth had just finished meeting with the funeral committee. I understand, Mrs. Pierce. But the investigation can't wait, Rachel replied firmly. The sooner we find out the truth, the sooner the Parsons' soul can rest in peace. This argument, strangely enough, worked. Catherine nodded reluctantly and stepped aside. Mrs. Brooks, Rachel approached the widow. I need to ask you some questions. Elizabeth looked up at her with tired eyes. Ask away, detective, but I've already told you everything I know. Yesterday you mentioned that you went to bed early because of a migraine. Was that before or after the evening service? After, Elizabeth answered without hesitation. I went to the service, then I talked to my husband and went home. He stayed at the church to finish some business. What did you talk about? Elizabeth cast a quick glance at Catherine. About plans for the weekend, nothing much of note. The witnesses saw that your conversation seemed strained. Perhaps my migraine was already starting, Elizabeth replied coldly. Were you aware of your husband's activities with Ashley Pierce? Of course, the widow straightened her back. James often mentored young parishioners. It was part of his ministry. Always alone? Not always, but Elizabeth hesitated. Some matters require privacy. Were you aware that your husband was taking pictures of Ashley without her knowledge? The question clearly caught Elizabeth off guard. She turned pale and then flared up. I don't know what you're talking about. James was a keen photographer. He often took pictures of people and nature for the church bulletin. I'll check the bulletin archives, Rachel nodded. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Brooks. Walking out of the church, Rachel took a deep breath. She sensed that both Ashley and Elizabeth were hiding something. But what was it? Parker. She turned to the officer waiting for her. Who's in charge of church records? Budget, expenses, donations? I think it's Deacon Thompson, Parker answered. Would you like to talk to him? Very much, Rachel nodded. And I also need to find out who saw Pastor Brooks after the evening service. Perhaps the church warden? An hour later, Rachel was sitting in the office of Deacon Thompson, an older man with a neat beard and a shrewd eye. To her surprise, he greeted her without the usual wariness of Roswell residents. I've heard of you, Detective Morris, he said, motioning for her to sit down. The Rodriguez case was impressive. Thank you, Rachel replied, a little puzzled by his friendliness. I'd like to review the church's financial records for the past year. It might help with the investigation. Of course, the deacon nodded. I myself wanted to draw your attention to some inconsistencies. He pulled a folder from a cabinet and placed it in front of Rachel. I discovered this about a month ago. Small but regular sums disappearing from the hardship fund. Nothing significant, but enough to notice on close inspection. Did you report it to Pastor Brooks? Yes, the deacon sighed. He said he'd look into it, but there was no change. Do you suspect him? I don't want to speak ill of the dead, Thompson shook his head. But the pastor's been different lately. Distracted, sometimes irritable. It wasn't like him. When had this change started? About 6 months ago, the deacon answered after a moment's thought. About the same time he began his studies with Miss Pierce. Rachel scrutinized the documents. Indeed, small sums of money from $100 to $300 were regularly withdrawn from the account, but they were not properly documented. Do you have a record of who was the last person to see the pastor on the night of his death? Officially, the custodian Harold Wilkins. He locked up the church around 10 p.m. Pastor was still in his office. But, the deacon hesitated. But, I saw something, Thompson said quietly. I live across the street from the church, and sometimes I walk my dog late at night. That night, about 11 o'clock, I saw Ashley Pierce come in the side door of the church. She looked around like she didn't want to be seen. Are you sure it was her? Positive. There aren't many girls in our town with that distinctive gait and red hair. Did you see her leave? No, unfortunately. I went home. Rachel thanked the deacon and left the church with more questions. If Ashley was at the church just before the pastor was killed, why did she lie about it? That's when an excited Parker ran up to her. Detective, we have a new witness, Mrs. Johnson. She lives across the street from the pastor's house. Says she saw some kind of scene between Mrs. Brooks and Ashley Pierce the day before the murder. 20 minutes later, Rachel was already sitting in the living room of Mrs. Johnson, an older woman with lively eyes and a love of gossip. It was awful, Detective. she readily recounted. I was watering the flowers on the porch when I saw Ashley coming out of the parsonage. She was crying. Elizabeth ran out after her, grabbed her arm, and said something. I couldn't hear what, but Ashley looked like she'd been hit. Then she broke free and ran away. When exactly did this happen? Monday, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The pastor wasn't home visiting patients at the hospital. Did you tell anyone about it? Only my sister. Mrs. Johnson looked a little guilty. We're not in the habit of making a mess of things. Rachel thanked the witness and thought. The picture was slowly coming together, but some of the details still didn't add up. She decided to talk to Elizabeth again, this time alone. Back at the parsonage, Rachel was surprised to find Elizabeth methodically sorting through her husband's study, putting papers into boxes. Mrs. Brooks, Rachel stopped in the doorway. What are you doing? Preparing the office for the new pastor, Elizabeth answered calmly. The church board has already started looking for a replacement for James. This is a crime scene. You mustn't touch anything. Your people have already taken everything they thought was important, Elizabeth continued, folding the papers. I just want everything to be ready for the future. Rachel walked over to her and gently took her hand. Elizabeth, I saw the witness who told me about your fight with Ashley Pierce the day before your husband died. What did you talk to her about? Elizabeth froze, her hand in Rachel's arm icy cold. It was a misunderstanding, she said quietly. Ashley was upset about something James had said. I tried to comfort her. She was crying when she left your house, and you didn't seem like the comforting type. You don't know me, Detective. Elizabeth wrenched her hand away. And you didn't know my husband. Our lives were more complicated than you can imagine. Then explain it to me, Rachel insisted. What was going on between your husband and Ashley? Why was he sneaking pictures of her? Why was she coming to the church late at night the day he died? Elizabeth turned pale. Was she there? Yes, and I think you can guess why. The widow sank into her husband's chair, suddenly very small and frail. I knew, she said, barely audible. I knew that James had a secret, something that was tormenting him. But I didn't want to see the truth. We'd been a pillar for this community for so many years, an example of a Christian family. How could I admit it was all a lie? What exactly did you know, Elizabeth? Rachel asked softly. I saw the way he looked at her, the way his voice changes when he says her name. Elizabeth raised her eyes to Rachel. I found the letters, poems he wrote to her. He didn't sign them, but I recognized his handwriting. Did you confront him? That night, after the service, Elizabeth nodded. I told him I knew everything, that he had to stop this madness. He promised to make it right. Said he'd talk to her that same night. And you went home? Yeah. I took a sleeping pill and went to bed. And in the morning, her voice broke. I found him dead that morning. Do you think Ashley could have? No, Elizabeth exclaimed. It's a child. She couldn't. She wouldn't. She's 18, Elizabeth. She is no longer a child. You can hardly understand the complexity of our relationship, the widow said bitterly, as a woman who has never... Understanding people is my job, Rachel replied calmly, especially when they're trying to hide something. And believe me, 7 years with a theology professor taught me a lot about the complexities of human connection. Elizabeth looked at her in surprise. Your partner is a theologian? Dr. Diane Klein, professor of comparative theology at the University of Chicago. I've lived with her longer than many of your parishioners have been married. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, clearly confused by this information. What's going to happen now? I need to talk to Ashley again, Rachel said, and her mother. And would you please stop destroying evidence? Anything you try to hide will only make it worse if it's important to the case. On her way out of the pastor's house, Rachel called Hammond. I need a warrant to look at Pastor Brooks and Ashley Pierce's phone records and put Mrs. Brooks' house under surveillance. She's shredding documents. You think she's hiding something? The chief asked worriedly. Everybody's hiding something, Chief Hammond. The only question is what it is and how important it is to our case. Back at the motel, Rachel poured herself a whiskey and laid out the case files on the bed. Pastor Brooks, a model family man and spiritual leader, had a secret relationship with a young girl. His wife found out about it and confronted him the night of the murder. Ashley secretly met with him at the church late that night. And then there was the missing money and the strange entries in the pastor's journal. Temptation is growing. I should stop, but I can't. She's like a light in the darkness of my hypocrisy. What happened that night in the pastor's office? Who delivered the fatal blow and why? How did Catherine Pierce react when she learned that her daughter had been the object of the attentions of the married pastor she so respected? Rachel sipped her whiskey and sighed. Tomorrow she had the hardest part ahead of her, a conversation with Catherine and another meeting with Ashley. She sensed the clue was close, but she hadn't seen the full picture yet. The phone jingled quietly, a message from Diane. "How are you doing, detective? Aren't the righteous judging you too much?" Rachel smiled and replied, "I'm hanging in there, but I guess their pastor wasn't so righteous. I miss you and Max." A second later came the reply, "So do we. Be careful, though. People whose illusions are crumbling can be dangerous." The morning of the third day of the investigation began for Rachel with two pieces of news: the results of the phone forensics and an unexpected visit. She had just had time to pour herself a cup of coffee when there was a knock on the door of the motel room. Chief Hammond stood on the doorstep with a folder in his hands and an atypically serious expression on his face. "We got Pastor Brooks's phone records," he said without greeting. "And you were right, and—" Rachel silently let him in and took the folder he held out. Inside were dozens of pages of call detail. The pastor called Ashley almost every day, sometimes multiple times. Some calls lasted only a minute or two, others over an hour. Most of the calls were late, after 9 p.m. "There's something else." Hammond pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. "We found this in the pastor's office when we did a second search, in a hiding place under the floorboards." Rachel opened the envelope. Inside were love letters, unsent apparently, and some photographs. Ashley was in the pictures, sleeping on the couch, reading a book, stepping out of the shower in a towel. "Shit," Rachel muttered quietly. "He was following her." "Not just following her," Hammond replied grimly. "The last two photos were taken at her house. He snuck in when she was alone." "This isn't just an affair anymore." Rachel shook her head. "It's an obsession. Have you talked to Ashley about this?" "No, I wanted to show you first. But there's more." Hammond handed her another document, the results of the audit of the pastor's bank account. "The money that's been missing from the church treasury, it's been transferred to a separate account. Over the last 6 months, about $5,000 had accumulated, and the week before the murder, the entire amount was withdrawn in cash." "He was getting ready to run," Rachel said thoughtfully. "He was collecting money to run away with Ashley." "Or he was preparing to be blackmailed," Hammond suggested. "These pictures, they're compromising. If Ashley had decided to end the relationship, we need to talk to her right now." Rachel stood up firmly. "And her mother, where are they now? They should be home. There's a funeral service at the church today, but it doesn't start until noon. Let's go." On the way to the Pierce house, Rachel pondered how best to approach this conversation. The topic was sensitive, and Catherine's reaction would predictably be violent. The Pierce family home was a typical upper-middle-class example. 2 stories, with a manicured garden and a white picket fence. When they pulled up, Rachel noticed the curtains on the windows twitching nervously. They were obviously expecting them. The door was opened by Catherine, dressed in a strict black suit, ready for the funeral service. When she saw Rachel and Hammond, she visibly tensed. "Detective Chief Hammond," she nodded demurely. "To what do I owe the honor?" "We need to talk to you and your daughter, Mrs. Pierce," Rachel said. "It's urgent and personal." Something in her tone made Catherine silently step back and let them into the house. In the living room, on the couch, sat Ashley, pale and tense. "Ashley, we need to talk about your relationship with Pastor Brooks." Rachel got straight to the point. "We have evidence that it went far beyond mentoring." "What insinuations?" Catherine was outraged. "Pastor Brooks was a decent man, and my daughter—" "Mom, please," Ashley interrupted her quietly. "Yeah, I want to tell the truth." Catherine stared at her daughter in amazement, and Rachel cautiously sat down next to her. "Tell us everything, Ashley," she asked softly. "From the beginning." Ashley took a deep breath. It started about a year ago. After Bible study, Pastor Brooks started telling me that he saw special spiritual potential in me, that I was chosen, that I had a special connection to God. At first, it was flattering. No one had ever spoken to me like that. She paused, choosing her words. Then he started saying that he and I are connected spiritually, that our connection was part of the divine plan too. He sent me verses from the Song of Songs, said they described us. When did the relationship become physical? Rachel asked cautiously. About 6 months ago. Ashley lowered her eyes. He said that through intimacy with him, I could experience divine love on a deeper level, that it was our secret, a sacred secret. Catherine made a strange sound, something between a sob and a strangled scream. Hammond delicately moved a glass of water toward her. I know how it sounds now, Ashley continued, her voice shaking. But back then, everything seemed right then. He was the pastor, the man everyone respected, the man everyone trusted. He spoke with such confidence, with such power. He manipulated you, Rachel said softly. He was using his authority and your faith against you. I only started to realize that recently, Ashley nodded. When he became different, more controlling. He wanted to know where I was, who I was talking to, checked my cell phone, and then he said we should leave together. Leave everything behind and start a new life. And you said yes? No, Ashley said firmly. It was too much. I told him I couldn't leave my school, my mom, my life. Then he, changed. He threatened me, said if I said no, he'd tell everyone I seduced him, that I was the one who initiated it. Who would believe me against him? Catherine finally found her voice. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, looking at her daughter with tear-filled eyes. I would never have. You idolized him, Mom, Ashley replied bitterly. You said how wonderful he was, how wise he was. I thought you'd choose his side. Never, Catherine shook her head. You're my daughter. I would always choose you. Rachel gave them a moment, then continued. Ashley, we found pictures that the pastor took without your knowledge. Some of them were taken at your house. Did you know about this? The girl's face turned even whiter. No, she whispered. Oh God, no. What about the money? Did he tell you about the $5,000 he withdrew from his account the week before he died? He said he'd raised the money for our escape, that he had everything he needed. Ashley tucked a strand of hair behind her ear nervously. I didn't know where it came from. And you met him at the church the night he died. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Ashley nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I came to tell you that it was over, that I'm not going with him. Angry. I'd never seen him like that. He grabbed me by the shoulders, yelling that I couldn't leave him, that I owed him. I broke free and ran away. What time was this? About 11 p.m., and you left the church? Hammond asked. Yes, I ran home. Mom wasn't there, she was at a charity dinner, and I just locked myself in my room and cried all night. Rachel glanced over at Hammond. The time coincided with the tentative time of the pastor's death. Ashley, Rachel began cautiously, the pastor was killed that night, sometime between 12 and 2 o'clock. You have to tell us the truth. Did you go back to the church after your fight? No! Ashley's eyes widened in horror. I swear I didn't go back. I would never. I believe you, Rachel said soothingly. But I need to know, can anyone confirm that you were home at that time? Ashley shook her head helplessly. No, I was alone. What about you, Mrs. Pierce? Rachel turned to Catherine. What time did you get home? About 1 o'clock in the morning, she answered. Dinner ended later than planned. There was a light on in Ashley's room when I got there, but I didn't go in to see her. Is there anything else you want to tell us, Ashley? Rachel asked. Something that might help with the investigation? The girl hesitated, then nodded. When I ran out of the church, I thought I saw Mrs. Brooks's car in the parking lot, but I'm not sure. It was dark and I was very upset. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. She needed to talk to Elizabeth again and check out some details. But before that, Ashley, do you mind if we take a look around your room? Maybe the pastor left some evidence in there when he visited you. Ashley nodded, clearly shocked at the idea of the pastor entering her home without her knowledge. Catherine, still pale with shock, escorted them upstairs. Ashley's room was typical for a girl her age. Bookshelves, a desk piled with textbooks, posters of indie bands on the walls. Rachel looked around the room carefully, paying special attention to places where pictures might have been taken from. In her desk drawer, she found a stack of letters from her pastor, high-minded spiritual musings interspersed with explicit romantic innuendo. And under the mattress, a small box with 2 gold rings. "Are these yours?" Rachel asked, showing it to Ashley. "No," the girl looked confused. "I've never seen this before." Rachel carefully opened the box. Inside was a note. "For our new life, soon we will be free. Looks like he prepared for your escape more thoroughly than you thought," Rachel said as she put the box away in an evidence bag. "Thanks for your cooperation, Ashley. We'll be back with more questions." As they walked downstairs, Catherine caught Rachel's arm. "Do you think my daughter was involved in the murder?" she asked bluntly. "I think your daughter is the victim, Mrs. Pierce," Rachel answered honestly. "But the investigation is not yet complete. For now, I ask you not to go anywhere and to be available for further questions." The next stop was the pastor's house. Elizabeth opened the door immediately, as if she had been expecting them. She looked calm, even peaceful. "Detective Morris, Chief Hammond," she nodded. "Did you recognize something?" "Yes, and we need to ask you some questions," Rachel answered. "May I come in?" Elizabeth led them into the living room. Rachel noticed that the house looked different. Some of the pastor's photos were gone and the books had been rearranged. "Are you preparing to move?" Rachel asked. "For a new life," Elizabeth replied simply. "After the funeral, I plan to visit my sister in Oregon. I might stay there for a while." "Mrs. Brooks," Rachel sat down across from her, "you said you took sleeping pills the night of the murder and slept. But Ashley Pierce saw your car outside the church around 11 p.m. Can you explain that?" Elizabeth didn't look surprised. "I lied," she said calmly. "After our conversation with James, I did go home. But then I realized I couldn't just wait. I needed to know that he would really stop this insanity with Ashley. So I went back to the church." "And what did you see there?" Ashley running out of the building in tears. "I waited a few minutes and went in. James was in his office, gathering some papers. When I asked him what happened, he, laughed. He said that Ashley was just scared, but that she'd change her mind soon, that they were leaving anyway, with or without my blessing." "And how did you react?" "I was furious." Elizabeth clenched her hands into fists. 15 years of marriage, 15 years of supporting him, being the perfect pastor's wife. And for what? For him to leave me for a girl who could be his daughter? "You had a fight?" "Yeah," I yelled, he yelled. He said I never understood him, that our marriage was a mistake, that Ashley gave him what I could never give him. True spiritual and physical intimacy. "And then what happened?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I left, got in my car and drove home. I took a double dose of sleeping pills and slept until morning. When I woke up, I realized James hadn't come home. I drove to the church and, found him." "You didn't tell anyone about your late-night visit to the church?" "No, I was, scared. I knew I'd be the first suspect." Rachel scrutinized Elizabeth. Her story sounded plausible, but there was something else, some detail she wasn't telling. "Mrs. Brooks, did you know that your husband was stealing money from the church treasury? That he'd raised $5,000 to run away with Ashley?" Elizabeth's face twitched. "No, I didn't know about the money, but that would explain his refusal to discuss church finances with me in recent months. What about the photos? About him spying on Ashley, taking pictures without her knowledge?" "God, no." Elizabeth looked genuinely shocked. "I knew he was obsessed with her, but I didn't think it was to this extent." "One last question, Mrs. Brooks. You said you had a fight with your husband and left. Did anyone see you leave the church?" Elizabeth thought for a moment. "I don't think so. It was late. The streets were empty. Although, there was a car across the street. I didn't pay attention to it at the time." Rachel nodded and stood up. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mrs. Brooks. Please don't leave town until the investigation is complete." As they walked out of the house, Hammond whistled quietly. "What a story. Who'd have thought this kind of thing would happen in our quiet little town?" "Quiet town, Chief Hammond," Rachel replied thoughtfully. I have another visit to make. Would you like to accompany me?" 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a modest house on the outskirts of town. A veteran Roswell police officer, former Chief James Tucker, met them on the porch. "Heard you got a big case here, Hammond," he hissed, inviting them inside. Pastor Brooks, who would have thought it? "Mr. Tucker," Rachel got right to the point. "I've been going over old police reports 15 years ago, when Pastor Brooks first came to Roswell. There was an investigation into his relationship with an underage parishioner in his previous parish. The case was closed for lack of evidence, but I'm interested in your opinion." Tucker frowned, his wrinkled face like a baked apple. "Yeah, there was one. The anonymous letter came a couple months after he was appointed. I went to Oklahoma, talked to the girl's family. They denied it, and she'd already gone to school in another state. They didn't want a scandal." "So you just closed the case?" "Look, Detective," Tucker leaned forward. "It was the year 99. Church scandals hadn't been so high profile yet. There was no evidence, nobody wanted to testify. And Brooks, he was charismatic, the congregation loved him. Besides, it was out of state, out of my jurisdiction." "Did you tell anyone about it? The church board? Mrs. Brooks?" "No, I didn't want to start the new pastor's ministry with gossip." Tucker shook his head. "Maybe that was my mistake." "Did you talk to Deacon Thompson about it?" "With Thompson?" Tucker looked surprised. "No, he wasn't a deacon yet, although, let me think. It's possible he might have known. He was on the committee to select the new pastor and had access to his papers." Rachel and Hammond looked at each other. This was new information worth checking out. Back at the station, Rachel spent the rest of the day analyzing the evidence and testimony she had gathered. Something was bugging her. Some detail she was missing. "Who killed the pastor?" she asked aloud, looking at the board of photos and notes. "Ashley, whom he had manipulated and blackmailed? Elizabeth, whom he planned to leave after 15 years of marriage? Catherine, who'd learned that her daughter had been victimized by a predator? Or someone else," Hammond added thoughtfully. "Someone who had something to lose if the truth came out." Suddenly, Rachel remembered Deacon Thompson saying that he had noticed the financial discrepancy a month ago and reported it to the pastor. If Thompson really did know about Brooks's past... "Chief, we need to talk to Deacon Thompson again and check out his alibi for the night of the murder." But when they arrived at the deacon's house, they got a surprise. Thompson had disappeared, leaving a short note. "I'm sorry. God forgive me." "Put out a bolo," Rachel said firmly, "and have everyone, Elizabeth, Ashley, Catherine, at the church in an hour. I think I know what happened." An hour later, the church was unusually quiet. In the front pew sat 3 women, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Ashley. All 3 looked exhausted and tense. Hammond took up a position by the door, and Rachel stood in front of them, feeling the strange irony of the situation. A lesbian detective preaching in a church. "I've gathered you here because this is a story of faith," she began. "Faith in people, in institutions, in authority, and how that faith can be betrayed." She paused, looking each woman in the eye. Pastor Brooks was not the man you thought he was. 15 years ago, he left his previous parish because of suspicions of an inappropriate relationship with a minor. There was no evidence, the case was dropped. But one person knew, Deacon Thompson, who was on the committee to select a new pastor. Elizabeth gasped quietly. Catherine clenched her fists, and Ashley stared at the floor. Thompson had been silent for 15 years. Perhaps he believed the pastor had changed, or was afraid of scandal. But a month ago, he'd discovered the financial irregularities and informed the pastor. And then I suspect he started following him and found out about his relationship with Ashley. Rachel stepped closer. There were several people at the church the night of the murder. Ashley, who came to tell the pastor she wasn't leaving with him. Elizabeth, who saw Ashley running out of the church and came in to talk to her husband. And Deacon Thompson, who neighbors said was walking his dog outside the church at an unusually late hour. She paused. "What happened after you left, Elizabeth?" The pastor was alone in the study, gathering papers to escape. Thompson probably saw you leaving and decided to seize the moment. He walked into the church, confronted the pastor, and something went wrong. "But why would the deacon kill him?" Catherine asked. "They had been friends for years." "Because of Ashley," Elizabeth said quietly, looking at the girl. Deacon Thompson's daughter had been about the same age when she left town 15 years ago. She Killed herself a year after she left. No one knew why. Rachel nodded. I found it in the old reports, and I think Thompson, seeing history repeating itself with Ashley, couldn't take it. He didn't come to kill the pastor, he came to stop him. But the conversation turned into an argument, and he took the statue from the shelf and struck the pastor on the head. Hammond finished. We found bloody clothes and a statue of an angel with traces of blood in the deacon's house. It was in the church, and then it was gone. Thompson took the murder weapon with him. There was silence in the church. Ashley cried quietly. Catherine put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and Elizabeth sat staring motionless in front of her. Had they found Thompson yet? Rachel asked. Yes, Hammond nodded. He turned himself in to the police in a neighboring county. He confessed to everything. Then the case is closed. Rachel turned to the women. But I want you to know that none of you are to blame for what happened. Not Ashley, who was manipulated by a man she trusted. Not you, Catherine, who didn't notice what was happening to your daughter. Not you, Elizabeth, who lived 15 years with a man who wasn't who he said he was. How are we going to live with that now? Catherine asked quietly. Day by day, Rachel answered simply. The truth is destructive, but it's also liberating. Now you can heal, knowing that there are no more secrets. As Rachel walked out of the church, she lit a cigarette, looking at the sun as it was setting. The quiet little town of Roswell would never be the same again. The facade of piety had been shattered, exposing the dark secrets behind it. But perhaps it was for the best. Sometimes you have to tear down the old to build something new, something more honest. Her phone rang. Diana. Hi, Rachel answered. I'm done, going home tomorrow. Did you catch the killer? Yeah, as usual, it all comes down to one thing. People kill when their illusions are shattered, when they can't bear the truth. Are you okay? Diana's voice was soft. I will be when I get home. Rachel smiled. To you and Max, to our own truth. She took one last look at the church with its whitewashed walls and tall steeple reaching for the sky. Behind those walls, people sought salvation, comfort, truth. But sometimes the truth came from a place you didn't expect it, from a stranger who saw things the locals preferred to ignore. Rachel put out her cigarette and walked toward the motel. She had one more night in Roswell, and tomorrow was the road home. To Diana, to Max, to her life, which may not have been perfect in the eyes of the people of a town like Roswell, but it was honest. And honesty, as she'd learned in her years as a detective, was the rarest and most valuable virtue of all.